how's it going? This is my second week in a row doing speeches and stories, lyrics, and letters. Why? As I told you, I am actually gone all next week, so I will be unable to watch, research, record, edit, and do all that for next Saturday. So I told you in my last video I'm going to do 2 weeks in a row. So that's what this is. So last week we did William Marshal Part 1. Part 1. William Marshal is a really cool guy. I really think he's awesome. Not everybody thinks so because they're not history nerds like me, but I think you can enjoy him. So last time we talked about, a lot of the early parts of his life where he becomes a knight and then starts serving kings, and then he serves Henry the young king, and then amazingly Henry the young king dies. But before he dies, he says, William, I made a vow to go on a crusade to the Holy Land. I am no longer able to fulfill that vow, so I want you to do it. I'm going to go ahead and turn the gain up on my microphone because I feel like I'm really, really quiet. And stand by for technical difficulties. Okay, so that's where we left off. William Marshal accepted the vow. Will he actually go to the Holy Lands? And the answer is yes. He did go to the Holy Lands. He went on a crusade in the name of Henry the young king, and we don't know much about what happened, except something later that we'll talk about. But yeah. So he left for Jerusalem in late 1183, came back sometime in the year 1185 or 1186. After he returned to England, he immediately returned to the service of King Henry II. He continued to show his loyalty through and through. So much so that when Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart, started a revolt against him, man, Henry II, his sons just keep on starting rebellions. That sucks. Anyway, William stayed loyal to Henry II. There was a skirmish. At one point, there was a skirmish between them, and Henry fled from Le Mans to Chinon. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but oh well. Anyway, I'm going to read this next part straight from the book. The book is The Greatest Knight by Thomas Asbridge, which I read in, I believe, 2020. Yeah. Actually, a funny story about how I came across that book. I was trying to watch this movie, Ironclad, which came out, I think, when I was in high school, and I thought, this is such a cool movie, and then it turns out that it's not historically accurate at all. But there's this character who's a Knights Templar, and his name is Thomas Marshal, and I was like, is this based on a real person, like the Siege of Rochester Castle? And so I was like doing some research, and it turns out that it was based on a true story, but Thomas Marshal was loosely based off of William Marshal. And there's a book about it called The Greatest Knight, and it was a book about the life of William Marshal, and that's how I found it. And it was on sale on Kindle at the time for like $3.99, so I bought it and read it. And I wish that I would reread it, but okay. Here is the excerpt. The remaining members of the royal household now formed a close bodyguard around the old king, the last line of protection against death or capture, determined to see their monarch and his son John to safety. They had covered some 2 or 3 miles when it became apparent that another party of knights was in hot pursuit, racing along the road behind and closing fast. Marshal and another household warrior, Marshal of the Rocks, de Roques, reined in and turned to bar their path, only to find none other than Richard the Lionheart bearing down on them. As Marshal of the Rocks moved to intercept one of the Duke's knights, William himself charged forward to confront Richard. The great tournament champion, which is William, was about to meet the Lionheart in single combat. The sources vary on the details, but one thing is certain, it was not a fair fight. So intent had Richard been upon hunting down his father that he had begun his chase wearing only a doublet and a light helm, which I guess is like very little armor from, at least that's how it reads. Okay. Having such little armor added speed, but left him dreadfully exposed to attack. It's late at night. Worse still, the Lionhearted was armed with only a sword, while Marshal had a shield and lance. According to the biographer, Richard shouted, "God's legs, Marshal, don't kill me. That would be a wicked thing to do, since you find me here, completely unarmed." Marshal could have easily killed the man, given the circumstances. He would not bring himself to kill an unarmed opponent, let alone the heir apparent to the Angevin realm. He shouted in reply, "Indeed I won't. Let the devil kill you. I shall not be the one to do it." And Marshal aimed his lance towards Richard's steed, thus becoming the only known person to have dehorsed and bested the Lionheart in single combat. Oh man, when I read that, I was like, 4 years ago, I was like, oh my gosh, the one guy that we know to have dehorsed Richard the Lionheart is also called the greatest knight who ever lived. That's so cool. Anyway, yeah, so we're gonna skip a lot here, but Henry II, he was already pretty old, but he ends up dying, and he does name Richard his his heir, and Richard accepts and then leaves pretty much immediately for Jerusalem to fulfill a crusade. He did very well on the crusades. That's where he, I believe that's how he got his name. Yeah. But while he's in Jerusalem, he effectively leaves Marshal in charge of England, along with other people who were more politically inclined. Marshal can be thought of as the sword. And then fear of his sword basically kept everybody in line while Richard was gone. Yeah. Later, after Richard goes to Jerusalem. Quite a few things happen. Quite a few people try to usurp the throne and all this stuff, but Marshal keeps everybody, England is Richard's. Richard comes back, and he's pretty famous. I believe he had to get ransomed in order to come back, but he did come back, and England was in his control thanks to Marshal, and they go to Normandy, and they actually he and Marshal begin to, in an offensive attack, to take French lands, to take more land. This attack, one of the attacks was at the fortress of Milly. Richard was not there for this particular day, but Marshal was in charge of leading the attack. He sent his men up towards the castle walls, and there was a dry moat, so they're going to the castle walls, and they are putting their siege ladders up against the walls. They're supposed to climb up, take the castle, right? Well, his men were getting defeated by arrows and crossbow bolts and things getting dropped on their heads, and his army started to become disheartened. Marshal saw that, he was the leader of the army, and at this point, he's in his 50s, and he's like the king's right-hand man, so he's not expected to be in battle, and there's no shame in it either. He's standing back, giving commands. He's the strategist, so it makes sense to not have him in combat. But he sees his men becoming disheartened, and he thinks, this can't happen. And he's in full armor, but he draws his sword, runs across the dry moat, starts climbing a ladder, and he swings his sword as he's climbing, and he defeats people, doesn't get hit by an arrow. He gets up to the top, climbs over, still killing people, and he fights one-on-one the leader of the castle and kills him. And his men are like watching him, like, oh my gosh, that old man is making us look like fools. And they see this act of valor and they're like, let's go, right? And then they win the day. That story also I just thought was so cool, especially because he was like in his 50s, which, in today's day and age with our medical uh science, I guess, we with our medical progress, medical science, I guess, we have pretty, it's easy for people to stay active longer in life. So this would kind of be like a man in his 70s climbing a ladder. At least that's my imagination. Um, yeah, swinging a sword. If you want to read more about that story, it's in chapter 9 of the book, The Greatest Night. It's so cool. Okay. Like I said earlier, I'm not going to go into all the details because I want to keep this pretty short and succinct for people. Okay. So Marshal had now served 3 kings. He served Henry II, Henry the Young King, and Richard the Lionheart. After Richard died, the throne, Richard died without an heir, so it went to Henry's other son, John. John is the absolute worst. I hate John. King John is the absolute. I hate him so much. In fact, he was so terrible that not a single person in the line of English royalty has named their son John since King John. Not a single one. That name they just refuse because they hate King John so much because he was so terrible. He was so bad to the people. He taxed the crap out of people and it was just bad. I hate him. Is it obvious? I hate him. Okay. Even so, Marshal served him loyally. He was always loyal to the throne of England, no matter who. And remember, a lot of these people tried to usurp the throne from the previous king that Marshal was serving. So Marshal was serving Henry II when Henry the Young King tried to usurp the throne, but Marshal stayed loyal. And then Richard tried to usurp the throne, but Marshal stayed loyal. And then he was serving Richard, and John tried to usurp the throne from Richard, but Marshal stayed loyal to Richard. Now he was serving John. He stayed loyal to the crown all the time, no matter what. John questioned his loyalty. Even so, Marshal remained loyal to the crown. Marshal helped John negotiate Magna Carta, the Great Charter of Liberties, often thought of as the first Bill of Rights for English common law. It was signed on June 15th of 1215 at Runnymede. This was only the first version of the document. It has been revised many, many, many times. John died a year later from dysentery, something with his gut. He deserved it. That's not people. I don't know if he deserved it. That's anyway. He died childless. The throne passed to Henry II's youngest surviving son, Henry III, who was only 9 years old at the time. Now I know what you're thinking. Dylan, his dad was Henry II. Marshal served his older brother, Henry the Young King. And now you're telling me that the youngest brother is Henry III? How does that make sense? And here's the thing. I'm not a historian. I don't know. But from my understanding, based on what I read, you only get the name if you were actually king. Henry the Young King was a co-heir? No, co-ruler with Henry II, but he didn't have any real power. It was theater, basically. So they call him Henry the Young King, but he's not in the line. Henry III actually was king he was not a co-ruler. He was just king. So that's why he's Henry III, even though his older brother was Henry and his dad was Henry II. Makes sense? Clear as mud. Okay. Henry III had to lean on Marshall's wisdom. Marshall was actually his king regent. Like I said, Henry III was only 9 when he became king. Marshall created a sort of a round table of knights, barons, that were loyal to King John during the Barons' Revolt just a few years earlier. Basically, people that he would have trusted. He led them, but they all served as, counselors and advisors to the king. Marshall died in early 1219, I believe it was May. The accounts say that he was plagued with illness and pain. He realized that he was dying, and he left the Tower of London and went to his personal estates. He gathered his family and made his final amends before dying in May of 1219. He was buried in Temple Church in London, and because of the vow that he took in secret, he was invested as a Knights Templar. I don't know precisely what that means, but it sounds awesome. So, William Marshal, the man who served 5 kings, was always loyal to the crown. Also, did a crusade. The only man to dehorse Richard the Lionheart in battle. The man who single-handedly turned the tide of a castle siege by climbing up a ladder and taking people on. He probably slaughtered like a dozen men in that process. While he was in his 50s, went on to negotiate Magna Carta and then died at the age of 7 in his early 70s. Man, what a life. So I wanted to share this story because I found it very inspiring when I first read it 4 years ago. And then there is an excerpt of a chapter in Powers and Thrones by Dan Jones, where he uses a lot of the chapter to sort of summarize his life as well. In a documentary, at one point, someone asks Dan Jones, William Marshal, is he the coolest man in medieval history? And Dan thinks about it and goes, yeah, I'm okay saying that. So he lived a cool, legendary life. But what I think is awesome, or what I think we should learn from his story, is that no matter the circumstances, he had the discipline to always be brave. He had the wisdom. He had the understanding. See how I fit in the 4 traits of the modern quest? He had those traits to always, he knew his responsibility was to the throne of England, no matter who was on it. He always served loyally, and he became trusted. He was known for his chivalry, and he was a man of honor. I believe he was also a man of God, but that, just an incredible story. And the last thing that's kind of cool about his story, too, is that I believe he is the inspiration for a fictional character in the Game of Thrones series, which I only read the first book of, and then Crystal asked me to stop reading them because they are gross in nature, which I agree. That story is really good, but it could have been told without all the gory details. Not even gory, sexual details. Anyway, there's a character in there. I believe his name is Sir Barristan Selmy, the white-haired knight, who is loosely probably based on William Marshal. So if you want to read up on his character biography, I think you'll find some similarities. He's awesome too. All right, Ryan, that is the story of one William Marshal, the Knight of the Realm, the greatest knight who ever lived, the Knights Templar, the Crusader, the man who negotiated Magna Carta. What a legend. William Marshal. That's all I have for today on Speeches and Stories, Lyrics and Letters. See you next time.